What about Lovecraft's father? Well, we know from commercial records that he was a commercial traveler, and he kept him and their family in the Boston area from 1890 to 1893, after which Winfield Scott Lovecraft was struck with an illness in April of 1893, which forced him to be placed in the Butler Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. And here he remained until his death in 1898. Because Lovecraft did not visit him during his stay at the hospital, he only knew him, vaguely for just a couple of years. So he says that my image of him is a bit vague. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Concerning his father, he wrote that he was educated both privately and at a military school, making modern language his study. In fact, Lovecraft notes that he was a lover of all things military, and in youth gave up an appointment to West Point only to please his mother. Lovecraft's father, however, here we go, was proud of his English background. Very proud. An Anglophile to the very end. And in fact, what happened is that he writes, in America, the Lovecraft line made some effort to keep from becoming nasally Yankeeized. My father was constantly warned not to fall into Americanisms of speech and provincial vulgarities of dress and mannerisms, so much so that he was generally regarded as an Englishman despite his birth in Rochester, New York. I can just recall his extreme, precise, and cultivated British voice. In fact, others called him a pompous Englishman. Lovecraft, on his own father, says, I remember this figure, an immaculate one, and shouting to him, Papa, you look just like a young man. I don't know where I picked this phrase up, but of course his father was tickled, Father, you look just like a young man, and slapped his waist, and, Dad laughed. But here's the thing, is that Lovecraft's father is connected to the formation of Lovecraft's character. You could see this already, slowly but surely. In fact, what will happen is that, unfortunately, Lovecraft's father was prejudiced in many different ways. Now, he's a product of lots of New England, especially Rhode Island. Rhode Island is not quite the most innocent state of all. If you guys remember that they were, of all the northern states, the most involved in the slave trade. And you had lots of former slavers there. And there is a certain attitude that was there at the time. And Lovecraft is participating in a part of that context. So you're going to see where this is interesting. In fact, later on, after Lovecraft's father went insane and was committed to the Butler Hospital, he had delusions, according to Butler hospital records, of believing somebody who is an African-American going after his wife, paranoid about it. So even that comes about. So you could see that some of these ideas are going to influence Lovecraft. Is that interesting? Well, we're learning things, right? Okay, so moving on along. Now, obviously, a lot of people say that, he had syphilis, his father. We're not sure. But Lovecraft was kept in the dark about his condition, and Dad just suddenly disappeared. What happened to him? He's not there anymore. And he did not visit, or was allowed to visit, his own father at the hospital. And so he didn't know. And so already you could see there are aspects of mental illness that is in the family. And you're going to see this as a theme in many different ways. By the way, There's an interesting thing is Winfield's cousin, Joshua Elliott Lovecraft, also died of this general paralysis that they think is actually syphilis only a few months after Winfield Scott Lovecraft. Just a little bit of trivia, interesting stuff. Okay, so what happens is now this idea of superiority, this idea that, the English, they're the best, continues through the son. He said that what happened, my aunt remembers that at an early age of 3, I wanted a British officer's red uniform and paraded around in a nondescript coat of brilliant crimson, originally part of a less masculine costume, and in a picturesque juxtaposition, of kilts, which me represented the 12th Royal Highland Regiment, Rue Britannia. That's what he says. At around the age of 6, when my grandfather told me of the American Revolution, I shocked everyone by adopting a dissident view. He says, Grover Cleveland was Grandpa's ruler, but Her Majesty Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland and Empress of India, commanded my allegiance. God save the Queen was a stock phrase of mine. When the death of his father, Lovecraft's grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, easily took over the paternal position, but you can already see, again, aspects of Lovecraft's character being already set. You see it, right? Are you seeing this? You're understanding? Okay. He said, of course, he loved his grandpa very much, and grandpa was very doting. They moved into the family home, which he absolutely loved, in Providence with his maternal grandparents. He loved it so much. He said that actually this place that they lived in was right next to a primal and open New England countryside with rolling meadows, stone walls, cart paths, brooks, deep woods, mystic ravines, lofty river bluffs, planted fields, white ancient farmhouses, barns and briars, gnarled hillside orchards, great lone elms, and all the authentic marks of a rural milieu unchanged since the 17th and 18th centuries. Why is that important, you Lovecraft scholars? Because already you could see a lot of his stories connect to this era, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and he is growing up within this context, which does bleed into, pardon the pun, into his later stories, right? He did admit that his house was an urban one at the very edge of this, but he loved living here. He was proud of living in the Phillips household. It caused me to grow up as a complete Rhode Islander, but he loved this city. He says, when I was 3 years old, I felt a strange magic and fascination, not unmixed with a vague unease and perhaps a touch of mild fear. In the ancient houses of Providence's venerable hill, with their fan-lighted doorways, railed flights of steps, and stretches of broad sidewalk. Yet, here's the interesting part. He loved his Rhode Island, but he loved it too much, to the point where he's not sure if he could set a lot of stories, the horror stories, in Rhode Island. But there was a sister area that he knew was a perfect context. And this started early on with his visits to a place known as, and staying at times, Massachusetts. Massachusetts, on the other hand, it had a dark legacy, right? The Puritans, right? And other Salem witch trials. And he's like, oh, this works. And so early on, he started to think to himself, now that is a place to set a horror story. And that, of course, will be the backdrop of many of his novels later on. So, in fact, there you go. In fact, what will happen is Lovecraft writes about this in his Pictures of a House, which he published in 1920. He says, horror haunts strange, far places. For them are the catacombs of the Ptolemies and the cavern mausoleums of the nightmare countries. They climb to the moonlight towers of ruined Rhine castles and falter down black cobweb steps beneath the scattered stones of forgotten cities in Asia. The haunted wood and the desolate mountains are their shrines, and they linger around the sinister monoliths on uninhabited islands. But the true epicure of the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end and justification of existence, esteem most of all the ancient, lonely farmhouses of the backwoods of New England. For there the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combined to form the perfection of the hideous. And his focus was, of course, the area of Massachusetts. Isn't this fascinating? So his words alone testify to that. So already at this point in his life, he's combining two elements together, the idea of wonder and the idea of terror. And he's bringing these together at a very early age. In fact, he understood his nature very well. He said, I should describe my own nature as quite complex. Interest consisting of three paramount and disassociation: A, love of the strange and fantastic; B, love of the abstract truth and scientific logic; C, love of the ancient and the permanent. Sundry combinations of these three strains will probably amount to all my odd tastes and eccentricities. Isn't that fascinating? So he defined himself. So Lovecraft became also transfixed with the idea of time and the passing of it. In fact, he said that time is a special enemy. So a dramatic moment in a traumatic one. He said, I always saw those newspapers bury the heavily ink date line Tuesday, or Wednesday or Thursday of this or that month, right? And it was always what year? It was always, 1894. But then something happened. On January 1st, 1895. All of a sudden, it changed. I was like, wait, is it supposed to be 1894? Because he got used to the idea and it changed on him. And that upset him. In fact, he started seeing time as a foe that he's always struggling with. And he started to think to himself that, I want to go back in time. I want to see, he says, 1066 or 1492 or 1642 or 1776. The idea of personally outliving the eternity was impressive to me. I shall never forget the sensation I derived from the idea of moving through time. If forward, why not backward? Which that 95 date line gave to me. That 1895 changed things. And he became not satisfied only to go back to the 18th century, but further back, thousands, even millions of years. And again, this idea, this obsession with time is another grand theme that you're going to see in the Lovecraft novels. He's always going back. Okay, concerning also one moment that happened in 1896. He says, when I was 6 years old, I was taken to visit in Western Rhode Island. And he met this ancient gentlewoman, a certain Miss Wood, who's a daughter of a rebel officer in the late unfortunate uprising against His Majesty's lawful authority, who was celebrating with proper pride her 100th birthday. So he had a chance to meet this 100-year-old woman who was part of the American Revolution. Oh, did you guys notice that? that she's a rebel. She betrayed us, she's part of that. That was interesting. You can see where Lovecraft is going in many ways. So what happened is she thought to himself, he saw, I could walk and talk. She could walk and talk when General Washington breathed his last. And so you could see that young as I was, the idea gave me a tremendous feeling of a cosmic victory over time. Wow. And this sense of time travel was also especially felt in a black, windowless attic room at his grandparents' home. He says at home, all the main books in the library, and the parlors and elsewhere were full of standard Victorian junk. Most of the brown leather old timers having been brandished to a windowless third-story trunk room, which is set up on shelves. So what happens? He says, but what did I do? What pray? But go with the candles and kerosene lamp to that obscure and nighted aerial crypt, leaving the sunny downstairs 19th century flat and boring my way back through the decades into the late 17th, 18th, and early 19th century by means of innumerable crumbling and long tomes of every size and nature. Oh, wow, this looks like another. Are you following? You Lovecraft people, are you following this? Yeah, so he's going to in the attic and he's exploring this much like he does in many of his books, right? Attics and basements and places like this. These ideas are already greatly entrenched in his upbringing. So he, in a sense, most people don't know this, he's writing what he knows. And he's connecting these experiences, putting them together in his various writings. So already at the ripe old age of 6 years old, he was starting to learn how to read. He's reading Cook's Hesiod, Ovid, Horace. Yeah. But he started out beyond Mother Goose, of course, Grimm's fairy tales. So that's a great way to start. But he started on that. It was read to him as early as 4 years of age. When he was 5, he was reading the Arabian Nights, which is one of his favorite works for a while there. So he liked that. It was then that I invented for myself the name of Abdu al-Rasad and made my mother take me to all the Oriental curio shops and fit me up with an Arabian corner in my very room. So you could see this. But again, from Arabian Nights, right? These are tales. There's crypts, there's tombs, there's caves, there's deserted cities. A lot of these ideas would crowd the Lovecraftian landscape. Then, of course, when he was 6, he encountered Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. With the illustrations by Gustave Doré. This was it. This was the moment. I'll say it again. All right. Gustave Doré did the illustrations. If you're familiar with him, he draws pretty scary figures. I think of his Dante's Inferno when he puts that together, right? What happens here is that he finds this weighty tome of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in a tall, stately Victorian library. He picks it up, and the title didn't matter at that time because, he wanted to look at the pictures, right? So what happened is he said they opened the book and behold, a hellish picture of a corpse ship with ragged sails under a waning moon. I turn a page. God, a spectral, half-transparent ship on whose deck a corpse and a skeleton play at dice. By this time, I am flat on the bearskin rug and ready to thumb through the whole book, of which I had never heard before. a sea full of rotting serpents and death fires dancing in the black air, troops of angels and demons, crazed, dying, distorted forms, dead men rising in their puturistics and lifeless manner, the dank riggings of a fate-doomed bark. Wow, this was a moment. He had the visual epiphany, and it caught his eye. From there, he got into Hawthorne's Wonder Book and the Tanglewood Tales, which started to move him towards Hellenistic myths. That's going to start to interest him. Then he came across Bullfinch's mythology. This was a huge moment. He became interested in Greco-Roman mythology. He writes, the creation of the world is a problem naturally fitted to excite the liveliest interest of man, its inhabitants. The ancient pagans, not having the information of the subject from the pages of scripture, had their own way of telling a story. Ovid's Metamorphosis followed in quick succession. Okay? Lovecraft's grandfather, Whipple Phillips, now becomes very influential. He encouraged his antiquarian interests, especially his interest in ancient Rome. He says his grandfather, he had loved to muse amidst the ruins of the ancient city. So his grandfather used to habitually visit Rome on business and had brought from Italy a wealth of mosaics, paintings, and other objects of art whose theme was more often classically Roman than Italian. He always wore a pair of mosaics in his cuffs for buttons. And of course, one had a view of the Colosseum, so tiny yet so faithful, and the other had a view of the Forum. Wow, Grandpa is influential, right? Well, it goes further. Furthermore, he had a child's reader that he devoured at the age of 6. There was a whole alluring section he talks about that was connected to Rome and Pompeii, he says. But guess what? He was also fascinated with those aqueducts. And you know what he thought about? That railroad bridge. The railroad bridge looked like the aqueducts. And he made this connection. He became obsessed with it. And you know what helped his obsession? His mother. His mother said, okay, sure. In fact, so what happened is that they went to the railroad bridge, and Mom says, yeah, this is just like a Roman aqueduct. Again, interesting, the passing or crossing over. Isn't this fascinating? This idea in his psyche. Okay, so what happened is that as time goes on, writing his friend Robert E. Howard in 1931, he says, I realized that the Romans were an extremely prosaic race, given to all practical and utilitarian precepts that I detest, and without any of the genius of the Greeks or glamour of the northern barbarians. And yet, I can't manage to think behind 450 AD, except as a Roman. So even though he said, hey, the Greeks, I admire them, philosophy and what they put together and literature and so forth, and the barbarians are so noble, but you know what? I'm a Roman. I can't help it. I'm stuck. It's very fascinating, his obsession with Rome, right? So what happened is that later on, of course, because of Rome, his interest in the Arabian Nights and the ancient East starts to slip away. He says, my Baghdad name and affiliations disappeared at once, for the magic of silks and colors faded before that of a fragrant templed grove, fawn peopled meadows in the twilight, and the blue beckoning Mediterranean. He's now switching over to the Greeks and Romans. These ideas need a manifestation. And so at the very young age of 6, Lovecraft became a writer. 6 years old. He became a writer. What was his first? Of course, he said that my attempts of versification, of which I made the first at the age of 6, now took a crude, internally rhyming ballad meter, and I sang the exploits of gods and heroes. His first surviving work, which he lists as his second edition, was entitled The Odyssey Written for Young People. His first edition, some people say dated before his 7th birthday. So very prolific at a very young age. Do you want to hear his first line? Or his early line? Here it is. The night was dark, O readers, hark, and see Ulysses' fleet. From trumpet sound back homeward bound, his hope, his spouse to greet. Wow, that's pretty good for 6. What do you think? Okay, so he's pretty prolific. So in fact, in this book, the 2nd edition, he actually lists other books that he published, and he has even the prices with Mythology for the Young, 25 cents, Ulysses for Young Folks in verse, 5 cents, and an old Egyptian myth, 5 cents, the Young Folks Iliad in verse, 5 cents, Ovid's Metamorphoses, 25 cents. Wow, that's pretty expensive. So apparently he's already writing lots of materials. Okay, so suddenly the Rhode Island School of Design, it opened in 1897, and they had, he said, a Greco-Roman displays that were presented awkwardly in the basement, but nevertheless, he was obsessed. He loved it. In fact, he said it was an enchanting world for me, a true magic grotto where unfolded before me the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. I have since seen many other museums of art, and I'm now sojourning but a 5-cent fare from the next grandest in the world, which is the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Yet I vow that none ever moved me as much or given me so close and vivid a sense of contact with the ancient world as that modest basement on Waterman Street Hill with its meager plaster casts. It's his first experience. That's what matters. The result was he declared himself a genuine pagan. He converted over to paganism at this point. But as opposed to me telling you that, why don't we let Lovecraft tell you that? How's that? So here we go. He states, when I was 7 or 8, I was a genuine pagan, so intoxicated with the beauty of Greece that I acquired a half-sincere belief in the old gods and nature spirits. I have, in literal truth, built altars to Pan, Apollo, Diana, and Athena, and I have watched for dryads and satyrs in the woods and fields at dusk. Once I firmly thought I beheld some of these sylvan creatures dancing under the autumnal oaks, a kind of religious experience as true in its way as the subjective ecstasies of any Christian. If a Christian tells me he has felt the reality of his Jesus or Jehovah, I can reply that I have seen the hoofed Pan and the sisters of the Hesperian Phaethusa. Isn't that fascinating, right? So I mean, there you have Lovecraft himself talking. He says, when Rome was presented to me in an unfavorable angle, the Sunday school horror of Nero and the persecution of the Christians, I could never quite sympathize in the least with the teachers. Uh-oh. Now all of a sudden, he's getting himself in trouble already. The guy's 7, 8 years old, and he's already having a conflicting opinion, and he's going against the standard quo. Isn't that fascinating? So are we learning that much of Lovecraft is already formed at an early age, right? Indeed, right? So what happens now? Okay, so he says, I felt that one good Roman pagan was worth any dozen of cringing scum riffraff who took up a fanatical foreign belief and was frankly sorry for the Syrian superstition that it was not stamped out. When it came to repressive measures of Marcus Aurelius and Diocletian, I was in complete sympathy with the government and not a shred of use for the Christian herd. To try to get me to identify with that herd seemed, to my mind, ridiculous. He further admitted, at 7, I sported an adopted name, Valerius Massala, and tortured imaginary Christians in amphitheaters. So there you have it. So Oh, wow. Okay. So are you getting the idea that Lovecraft loves pushing buttons, right? Can you imagine the poor Sunday school teacher just sitting there going, oh no, it's like young Sheldon in Sunday school, you know? It's like, oh no, here comes Lovecraft, right? But there's others, right? Unfortunately, there's something that happened that now affected his literary style. On January 26, 1896, Lovecraft's maternal grandmother, Roby Phillips, died. The death of my grandmother, he says, plunged the household into gloom from which it never recovered. He said the black attire of my mother and aunt terrified me and repelled me to such an extent that I would surreptitiously pin bits of bright cloth or paper to their skirts for sheer relief, right? But what happened is all of a sudden he got depressed. The idea of death now impressed him, and to the point where it dislodged his very young and quite impressionable mind. And so he mentions the fact that there's this wound of melancholy that seemed to follow him. And then all of a sudden, something happens. It was then that my former high spirits received their damper. I began to have nightmares of the most hideous description, peopled with things that I call night gaunts, a compound word of my own coinage. I used to draw them after waking. Perhaps the idea of these figures came from an edition of Deluxe of Paradise Lost with the illustrations by Dorr, which I discovered one day in the Eastern parlor. In dreams, they were wont to whirl me through space at a sickening rate of speed, the while fretting and impelling me with their detestable tridents. It is fully 15 years, more since, as I've seen these night gaunts. But even now, when half asleep and drifting vaguely over a sea of childhood thoughts, I feel a thrill of fear and instinctively struggle to keep awake. This was my own prayer back in 96, each night, to keep awake and ward off the night gaunts. He described these night gaunts as black, lean, rubbery things with barbed tails, bat wings, and no faces at all. So now he's being terrified with these dreams. Bad timing, because right after that, he came across Edgar Allan Poe. So if anything is going to support these dark notions, it's going to be Poe. And he actually said, then I struck Edgar Allan Poe. It was my downfall. And at the age of 8, I saw the blue firmament of Argos and Sicily darkened by the miasmal exaltations of the tomb. He wrote his first major work called The Noble Eavesdropper in 1897, right? But not very Poe-like. His second story was called The Little Glass Bottle. It talks about, it's basically a treasure story. That went back to a certain Captain William Jones, found a bottle that was supposedly from 1864 that marks out a treasure. And then, this captain goes search it, for this treasure, because X marks the spot. He arrives at the spot and there's another bottle that basically says that this is all a practical joke. And so he responds, probably the best line. He said, I like to kick his head off, referring to the person who led him on this wild goose chase. Then he wrote a work called The Secret Cave in 1898. Well, this guy, Lovecraft is 8 years old at this time. He's already writing this. He is very prolific. Now, I want to tell some of these stories because it really does tell you how he changes over a period of time. It tells the story of a 10-year-old, which is 2 years older than himself, a 10-year-old John and his younger sister Alice. And they were told by mom and dad to be good children. Be good. Don't get yourself in trouble. Of course, soon as the parents leave, what happens? They get in trouble, right? And they go into the basement and they find all this mess. And then you're thinking, this is kind of a cute story, right? And they remove an obstacle in the basement, and suddenly all this water goes at them and floods the basement and kills his sister. What? Wait, what? That got dark pretty fast. And he describes at length his sister's dead body and what it looked like. Oh, looks like Lovecraft is coming about, right? This interesting twist at the end. But there you have it. Nice, cute story, and then tragic and violent. He was also influenced by dime store novels. He loved a good detective story. He started being influenced by Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, so another story he liked to read was another one he wrote, was The Frozen Pirate, where a ship was discovered in Antarctica, trapped in ice for many years. The crew was frozen solid. However, one starts to thaw, he comes to life, but as soon as he starts to rot and die right after that. So again, something else that you see that's familiar with Lovecraft. In 1898, Lovecraft added to his list his interest in the sciences. Wow, science is interesting. So what does he start? Of course, a daily scientific gazette at the age of 8. Wow. And so, but he says, yeah, it degenerated from a daily to a weekly. Can you believe it? It's like, wow, as if he had enough material to go on that long, but he did, right? In fact, he decided to go beyond just studying science. He's going to test out various hypotheses. So one of the neighbors, Paul Cook, notes that there is a section of Providence that was then open fields, rather swampy here and there, with very few houses. One day, this neighbor, Mrs. Winslow Church, noticed that someone had started a grass fire that had burned over quite an area and was approaching her property. She went out to investigate and found the little Lovecraft boy. She scolded him for setting such a big fire and maybe endangering other people's property. He said very positively, I wasn't setting a big fire. I wanted to make a fire 1 foot by 1 foot. Obstinate, right? Challenging authority. Then he got interested in biology. Well, so, and soon the facts of life became interesting, but he basically said that he didn't want to hear it from the parents. So I am going to, basically, he said to himself, I'm going to study biology myself, and especially the taboo topic of sex. That's right. So here he goes, diving in at 8 years of age, right? So what happened is, because he noticed that there's embarrassments of adult speech and oddly inexplicable allusions and situations in standard literature. And so, but he said the result was the very opposite of what parents generally fear after his research. For instead of giving mean, abnormal, and precocious interest in sex, his studies at the age of 8 virtually killed my interest in the subject. The whole matter was reduced to prosaic mechanism, which I rather despised, or at least thought was non-glamorous because of its purely animal nature and the separation from such things as intellect and beauty, and all the drama was taken out of it. And so for the rest of his life, Lovecraft had a lackluster attitude towards sex. And we'll talk, and later on, I'll mention Sonia Greene and what his wife will say about Lovecraft as a lover. We do know. So there you go. Also in 1898, he decided to learn Latin, and influenced by Ovid and Virgil and Horace, he translated the first 88 lines of Ovid's Metamorphoses again in 1898. Then all of a sudden, Lovecraft claims that he suffered 2 nervous breakdowns, one in 1898 and one in 1900. He says, I didn't inherit a very good set of nerves since relatives on both sides of my ancestry were prone to headaches, nerve exhaustion, and breakdowns. He mentioned that his grandfather had frightfully blind headaches. And of course, he said that his mother, who could run him a close second when it came to headaches. So both his mom and his grandfather that had these headaches. And of course, he thought also something was wrong with his dad when it came to mental illness. And so it just runs in the family. Of course, the Butler Hospital was a place where his father ended up and later on died. And his mother would later on have a nervous breakdown. And guess where she ended up? In the very same Butler Hospital. Yeah, so he is surrounded, and he himself has these various mood swings. What about his mother? We can't forget Mom, right? His mother spoiled Lovecraft, given into his moods. She was very overprotective, but always treated him just like a baby. In fact, his future wife says that as a baby, Howard looked like a beautiful little girl. He had a tender age of 3 years old, a head of flaxen curls of which any girl would have been proud. In fact, Mom actually wanted a girl, even put together a hope chest to the point where he was saying at the ripe age of 6 into 7, he used to say, "I'm a little girl." By the time he was 8 years old and she enrolled him in dance class, he actually decided this is not going to work out, and quoted Cicero stating, "Scarcely any sober person dances unless by chance that he is insane." And so he got violin lessons instead. He also, Mom says, you don't have to go to Sunday school anymore, because he had also proclaimed himself as a bona fide pagan. So that stopped. And I'm sure that Mom got lots of complaints in that area. He was a very unpopular child. Nobody seemed to like him. He said, since I would insist on playing out events in history or acting according to consistent plots, I was used to a doll company, he says. He said, my favorite toys were the very small ones, which would permit of their arrangement in widely extensive scenes. In fact, what he did is he created these elaborate scenes. This is another important thing. He created these very elaborate scenes. I had all sorts of toy villages with small wooden or cardboard houses, and by combining several of them, would often construct cities of considerable extent and intricacy, toy trees of which I had an infinite number, and he would create these gigantic sets, oftentimes set in the past, and he would unravel all these plots as he created these scenes. Again, are you seeing the connection between the visual and the written? And he's acting it out little by little. He said, so there you have it. He said horror plots were frequent, though oddly enough, I never attempted to construct fantastic or extraterrestrial scenes. I was too much of an innate realist to care for fantasy in its purest form at that time. So there you have it. He was not inactive. He loved to bicycle everywhere. He called himself a veritable bike centaur. So going up and down all over the place. He tried the elementary school, the Slater Avenue School, and he found the instruction quite useless. And he already knew how to read. He already knew mathematics. He already knew the sciences. So it's kind of like useless. So they pulled him out again, and he did his own self-educated thing for a little while, In 1901, Lovecraft became fully enchanted by Antarctica. He collected everything about this unknown continent, and he wrote 3 works on the topic. Voyages of Captain Ross, 1902, Wilkes Exploration, 1902, and Antarctic Atlas. He also, at the ages of 11 or 12, he decided that he needs to articulate his pagan beliefs. And so he wrote a work known as the Poemata Minora, 1902, which was dedicated, he says, to the gods, heroes, and ideals of the ancients. He describes this as a rather pompous book. So there you have it. He wanted to address the idea that he was now part of the old pagan religion, and he wanted to show that he rejected his Baptist faith that's practiced by his family. And so, in fact, he was determined to renew with vigor the Greco-Roman religion. So what is this? You guys want to know what it says? You guys want to hear? Sure, I'll give you an excerpt. Here we go. I have a few excerpts. And because he wrote a few works, right? He says, Olympian gods, how can I let ye go and pin my fate to this Christian creed? Can I resign the deities I know for him who on a cross for man did bleed? He continues, how in my weakness can my hope depend on one God alone? Though mighty be his power, why can Jove's host no more assistance lead to soothe my pains and cheer me of my troubled hour? He wrote an ode to Selene and Diana. He says, take heed, Diana, of my humble plea, convey me where my happiness may last, draw me against the tide of time's rough sea, and let my spirit rest amid the past. He says, the modern world with all its cares and pain, the smoky streets, the hideous clanging mills, fade neath thy beams, Selene, and again we dream like shepherds on Chaldea's hills. He also thinks of ancient Rome. How dost thou lie, O Rome, neath the foot of Teuton? Slaves are thy men, and bent the will of the conqueror. Whether hath gone great city, the race that gave law to all nations, knew no defeat, but gave it to all who attacked thee. So he's pretty overt about his beliefs. What do you think? So Lovecraft does nothing subtle. Nothing subtle. And everything is about this conflict, right? You know, he has this inner tension, outer tension. Then he discovers something else. Astronomy. Wow. Wow. Here's the next part, right? Now he becomes fascinated with outer space. And so mom gave him a nice telescope, right? I used to sit at night after night absorbing the minutest detail of the lunar surface. Till today, I can tell you of every peak and crater as though they were topographical features of my own neighborhood. I was highly angry at nature for withholding from my gaze the other side of the satellite. And so he now guess what he writes? Yes, he writes a various treatises on astronomy, which, by the way, still survive. And he writes four of these. And then all of a sudden he stumbles on somebody else. Who? Jules Verne. Wow, the next one, right? And of course, he talks about the immortal Jules, and how fascinated he was with him, and how this now connected to his interest in something else. The beginning, of course, of his fascination with science fiction. So all these elements are coming together. Finally, they said, you need to go to school. So 1902, they threw him back to school. He lasted to 1903. He says, I was considered a bad boy, for I never would submit to discipline. When censored by my teacher for disregard of rules, I used to point out to her the essential emptiness of her conventionality. Can you believe that? It's like, what? Okay. In such a satirical way that her patience must have been quite seriously strained. Withal, she was remarkable kind, considering my intractable disposition. He was a sharp student. He graduated top of his class. And then he was asked to make a speech at the graduation. He said he's not going to. And then that day he decides, I changed my mind. And then he makes the speech. This is awful. He makes the speech, and he decided to make it as long as possible. So I'll read the introduction so you get, if you picture he's graduating. Here's the problem child, right? This is the big moment. And he says, ladies and gentlemen, had I not thought to trespass upon your time and patience at the time, but when the muse impels, it becomes a man ill to strive her demands. When I speak of the muse, I do not mean to say that I am about to inflict my bad verses upon you. Far be that from my intention. My muse this day is Clio, who presides over the affairs of history, and my subject, a very revered one to me, is the career of one who rose from the most unfortunate condition of insignificance to the utmost height of deserved eminence. That's right, Sir William Herschel, and from a Hanoverian peasant became the greatest astronomer of England and therefore of the world. That's his introduction. No, this is not even. No. This is like a middle school. Yeah. So as you can see that, yeah, this is 1903. Yeah. So much to my concern, he said they offered elicited smiles rather than my attention. They thought he's just being funny, but he still felt well compensated for all his trouble. Now he's now diving into Sherlock Holmes, fascinated with that. And so what does he do? At the ages of 13 and 14, he forms a club. Why not? And suddenly he has friends because they can identify with detective stories. So he created what's called the Providence Detection Agency, whose members range, he says, between 9 and 14 years of age. He says, how many murders and robberies were unraveled? Our headquarters were in a deserted house just out of the thickly settled area. And there we enacted and solved many a gruesome tragedy. I still remember my labors in producing artificial blood stains on the floor. But Grandpa's fortunes were starting to wane. And so they had to start leaving, letting the servants go one by one. 1904, one of Whipple's largest business ventures collapsed. And then as a result, Whipple suffered from a stroke and died a few months later. His mother was forced to sell the family home, and it got so bad that he thought of suicide. Yeah, just, really. So once more, then in the fall of 1904, Lovecraft began high school. And later, and unlike his earlier experience, he actually had friends. This is high school seemed to work for Lovecraft. He also wrote his first notable work in 1904, entitled The Beast in the Cave. And so he wrote that about a man touring the Mammoth Caves. He becomes separated from his guide and becomes lost. And eventually he finds this creature who kind of approaches him, and he picks up a stone, throws it at the creature. The creature falls, and the creature mutters its last breaths, and he sees its face and discovers it is actually a deformed human who had become lost in the cave years ago. Then all of a sudden he wrote another work. Here it comes, right? He starts writing more and more works as time goes on, but this is still a very dark time. In fact, Lovecraft doesn't talk much about his personal life during 1905, 1906, 1907. It's kind of a, and there's lots of things going on because him and his mom, they're forced to move to another place. A lot of people thought that they were fighting all the time, their next door neighbors, but in reality, they're just reciting William Shakespeare to one another. So, doting mom. But he also, then in 1908, he wrote The Alchemist, right? This is the big moment, right? The Alchemist, right? So, of course, obviously, many of you know the story about the curse of everybody dying at the age of 32. And in the end, it turns out to be, of course, a relative who had cursed them, right? And who says at the end, I have lived for 600 years to maintain my revenge, for I am Charles Le Saussure. There it is. All right. Lovecraft suffered from another unknown health situation in 1908, insomnia, headaches, nervous weakness, and he couldn't do anything. As a result, he was not able to finish high school. He had wanted to go to Brown University, and he could not even do that. Oh, now follows another dark time, 1908 to 1913. In fact, Clara Hess writes that Lovecraft became so hideous that he hid from everyone and did not like to walk upon the streets where people could gaze at him. So, wow. So this is a really dark life, so terrible things are happening. But there you have it. Lovecraft, meanwhile, still was interested in many things, and he decided to get into organic chemistry during this period of time. He seemed to love it, except he had one thing that stopped him from going into chemistry even further. And that is, he hated math. He absolutely hated math. In fact, he loathed it so much, he said that it got him sick and gave him terrible headaches. So that was not for him. So now he writes a work that is kind of a science fiction work. And here it starts. It's called Providence in 2000 AD. and it showed a vision of the future where the English, those of English descent, the Americans, true Americans were being replaced by Irish and the Italians and Portuguese and Jewish immigrants. So he's writing this. So all of a sudden, this is the first show of a prejudicial perspective right here. And the work again is called Providence in 2000 AD. Then he started to, during this time, he started to decide to write various letters back and forth to pulp periodicals, and especially the Argosy. And in fact, he had a writing duel with a certain Fred Jackson, who wrote many articles or I should say many stories in this particular journal, excuse me. He called him trivial, effeminate, and in places coarse, his writing. So this started a huge fight. So now everybody's reading this periodical, and Lovecraft was fighting this master writer, Fred Jackson, and they're going back and forth, and he's gaining attention through this animosity. And as a result, a certain Edward Doss of the United Amateur Press Association, also known as UAPA, again, United Amateur Press Association, invited both Lovecraft and Russell to join the association in April of 1914. And all of a sudden, he found his home. This was the beginning of him finding, kindred spirits, and yes, eventually his wife, right, through this circle. He said, with the advent of the United, I obtained a renewed will to live, a renewed sense of existence, and so forth and so on. Okay. In 1915, he was elected vice president of the UAPA. In 1917, he was elected president. Oh, so he moved up pretty fast. And he advocated archaic uses of the English language. We need to go back to the old forms. Color, C-O-L-O-U-R. Come on, guys, get with the story, right? At this time, he finally published in 1916, The Alchemist, that he wrote earlier. Okay. And then, of course, Paul Cook, another UAP member, encouraged him to continue writing and publishing. So he wrote a work called The Tomb, which is published in 1917. And there you have that. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I wish I could. I do have it all here. The next work was Dagon, written in 1917, but published in 1919, right? And it is, it becomes really the kind of story that he became well known for in many ways. Of course, we can talk about, the ship is captured by an Imperial German sea raider. And so this person escapes into a lifeboat and drifts aimlessly, right? And he's stranded on a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about him in a monotonous undulations as far as he could see. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and less describable things, which he saw protruding from the nasty mud of unending pain. Okay, unending plain, excuse me. I like the other one though. Anyway, and so what happened is, this is the ocean floor. And after dried up, after 3 days, he found a mound at the edge of an immeasurable pit or canyon, and a gigantic white stone object that he soon perceived to be a well-shaped monolith. And he saw unfamiliar hieroglyphics on it: fish, eels, octopuses, crustaceans, mollusks. But he also saw signs of these sort of humans worshiping this creature. And then suddenly this creature does appear, right? Wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and less pleasant to recall. And of course, he does flee. He runs. He returns back. He ends up in a San Francisco hospital after being rescued. And of course, there is this haunting memory, and you're going to have, and he starts to contemplate taking his life, because he goes crazy. And the end is fascinating. He declares himself ready to do himself in. And in fact, the story is a suicide note. The story ends with the narrating hearing a noise at the door as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it before shouting, "God, that hand, the window, the window," and it ends. Okay, speaking of hands, Lovecraft then continued to try his hand in science fiction. He wrote in 1919, Beyond the Wall of Sleep, about a certain Joe Slater, an inmate who had died at a facility a few weeks after being confined as a criminally insane murderer. Are you seeing kind of some interesting themes here? Criminally insane, mental. Are you seeing that it is part of his experiences? You know, so he is writing what he does know. And yet he says this white trash of the South, for whom laws and morals are non-existent, was able to say the most crazy things that defied all understanding. In fact, at one point, he talked in his inadequate language, visions of green edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music, and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all, did he dwell upon some mysterious blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he would soar through the abysses of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in the way. Wow. And then this man had nightly attacks, right? This entity, blazing entity trying to get its revenge. So there you have it. So yeah, he's going there when it comes to science fiction. Moving right along. Of course, ultimately, I just want to say that they wanted to learn more. There was this supposed individual who had telepathic communication and was able to connect with this criminal mind and be able to see what was going on. And in this is a fascinating vision. He explained that we are not shackled to our physical bodies, that we, all humans, are actually light beings, and talks about that. He says that also the light is going to be connected to this last battle with its nemesis known as Algol and so forth. And then, of course, this battle supposedly happened, and then a star shone in the sky, then went away. Excuse me. All right, so we're getting to World War I. I get, of course, extra time because we started very late. But you want to hear everything that I promised you, so here we go. Well, he wanted to fight in World War I. But guess who did not want him to fight in World War I? His mother. So his mother made it clear that she would do everything to prevent him from joining this effort. And so even though he passed the physical, she wrote all of these letters, a letter campaign, not allowing her son to join. So he ended up becoming part of the National Guard of Rhode Island. He observed the war, even though he wanted to fight against the Kaiser. He did say, as to the general situation, it seems very discouraging low right now. It may take another second war to adjust things properly. Things that are going on. So then his mother, Susie, had a complete mental breakdown during the winter of 1918 to 1919. We don't know the exact details, but she suddenly had visions and started seeing strange things. In fact, she described weird and fantastic creatures that rushed out from behind buildings and from corners at the dark. Well, isn't that fascinating? Wow, mom, dad, grandpa, isn't this interesting? Again, his context. Like his father, mom ended up in the Butler Hospital, committed in March of 1919. He went through, of course, yet another Great Depression. But toward the end of 1919, he started to, move out of his shell a little bit. In the aftermath of World War I, he started to have a new view of life. And he started to question his ideals as if they were not questioned earlier. And he says that the peace conference, Friedrich Nietzsche, Samuel Butler, the modern one, Mencken, and other influences have perfected my cynicism a quality which grows more intense as the advent middle life removes the blind prejudice whereby youth clings to the vapid all's right with the world hallucination from sheer force of desire to have it so. Oh, wow. As for religion, uh, he obviously no, all religion. He just started to say no to it. He said religion is still useful amongst the herd, that it helps their orderly conduct as nothing else could. The crude human animal is superstitious, and there is every biological reason why they should be. Take away his Christian God and saints, and he will worship something else, he says. He also says, we all know that any emotional bias, irrespective of truth or falsity, can be implanted by suggestion in the emotions of the young. Hence, the inherited traditions of an Orthodox community are absolutely without evidential value. If religion were true, its followers would not try to bludgeon their young into artificial conformity, but would merely insist on their unbending quest for truth, irrespective of artificial backgrounds or practical consequences. With such an honest and inflexible openness to evidence, they could not fail to receive any real truth which might be manifesting around itself. And he goes on, right? No, he moved to another philosophy. It's almost the mechanism of materiality, the mechanism of materiality, rather than that which is metaphysical. And so he read Hugh Elliott's work, Modern Science and Materialism, and he embraced these ideas. Number one, the uniformity of law. Number two, the denial of teleology. And number three, the denial of the form of existence other than those envisaged by physics and chemistry. And so he subscribed to a scientific view of the world. But what is interesting is he clung to Newtonian metaphysics. Yeah, it's, in the age of, relativity happening, and of course, Einstein and everything else. Why he clung to that, I don't know, but he did. And he held those views for quite a while. And he also said beyond a certain limit of knowledge may be impossible with man's present sensory and intellectual equipment. So he says that we live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. In fact, he said, you know what? I believe that Western civilization is going to fall. Whoa, kind of dark on that one, right? So he talked about that. In fact, he loved Oswald Spengler when he says, mankind has no aim, no idea, no plan any more than the family of butterflies or orchids. Mankind is a zoological expression or an empty word. I see in place of that empty figment of one's linear history, which can only be kept up by shutting one's eyes to the overwhelming multitude of the facts, the drama of the number of mighty cultures, each springing with primitive strength from the soil of mother region to which it remains firmly bound throughout its whole life cycle, each stamping its material, its mankind in its own image, each having its own idea, its own passion, its own life, will, feeling in its own death. Well, both Spengler and Lovecraft believed that everything is going to come to an end, Western civilization, and something else will replace it. Again, this fatalistic idea. In fact, life moved in cycles constantly. He says, I am inclined to think that all entity evolves in cycles, that sooner or later, everything occurs practically all over again. As to the origins of a supposed deity, if one always existed and always will exist, how can he be developing creation from one definite state to another? Nothing but a cycle is in any case conceivable. A cycle, a rearrangement, if that be a tenable thought. Nietzsche saw this when he spoke of the Eivaken, right? Vederkunft. In absolute eternity, there's neither starting point nor destruction. Okay, so that becomes his view. Well, he's going to eventually change it. What do you mean? What? He's going to change his views? Yeah, because Lovecraft does this all the time. See, he changes his views to the idea that not cycles, he moves it to the idea of entropy, right? And so he says entropy is a very specific type of chaos. It is the chaos of pure homogeneity, which is not a condition that usually springs to the mind when we think of chaos, but it, in fact, total equality is distilled Platonic realization of chaos. And so this idea here is, as the origins, what happens here is that everything is just slowly winding down. The energy is moving out of the universe, becoming less and less. Well, now he continues writing The White Ship, the doom that comes to Sarnath, which is a great story I wish I could tell you about, but I can't. At this time, a pivotal moment was when he met Frank. Oh, this is good. Frank Belknap Long, who was to become one of his best friends. Long had quite a literary career, writing horror and science fiction, fantasy, gothic romance, even nonfiction, writing for both pulp and comic books. The guy lived to 1994. The guy is, and he had a very interesting view on Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And so he obviously, Lovecraft encountered him via his letter writing, going back and forth. Although their first meeting wasn't good as far as his estimation of his writing. He says that basically Long's Dr. Whitelock's Price was frankly a boyish and elementary story. But he liked his second work called The Eye Above the Mantle, in which Long combined Poe and Nietzsche together, and Dunsany, right? Where the human race meets its ends, and what happens, they're replaced by the Uberman, the Superman. A new race is born. He liked that one. But what he liked most is that they both love cats. What? They both love cats. So here we go. So eventually Lovecraft would publish one of Long's stories in his very own Conservative, the name of his own little magazine, in July 1923. Phyllis, a prose poem. I'll read a little excerpt of this if you want, right? He says, so Long says, someday I shall drown in a sea of cats. I shall go down, smothered by their embraces, feeling their warm breath upon my face, gazing into their large eyes, hearing in my ears their soft purring. I shall sink lazily down through oceans of fur, between myriads of claws, clutching innumerable tails, and I shall surrender my wretched soul to the selfish and insatiable god of felines. That's sweet. So, but then again, Lovecraft himself wrote about cats. In fact, he had a story called The Cats of Ulthar, where he published in 1920, where there is basically an unnamed narrator who has a pet cat. And he talks about the time when something happened to create a law that made it illegal to kill cats. The story goes that there was this mean people who, old Cotter and his wife, and they loved just to spend their time trapping and killing cats. Well, some visitors were coming to town, going through a caravan, and there was an orphan by the name of Means, right? And her, and his cat, his black cat, suddenly disappeared. So what does Means do? Unable to find his cat on the third day, Means makes a great prayer. And this prayer moves the shapes of the clouds of the sky. And everybody in the village, they can't find their cats anywhere. Where do those cats go? Well, they noticed that what happened is these cats were surrounding the Cotter's house. And then after that, the next morning, the cats returned to their owners. They were very well fed, by the way. And of course, they found the abandoned house and they found two skeletons that had been picked clean. And therefore, it was illegal to kill cats. Now, Lovecraft says this about cats. He says, throw a stick and the servile dog wheezes and pants and stumbles to bring it to you. Do the same before a cat, and he will eye you with coolly polite and somewhat bored amusement. And just as inferior people prefer the inferior animal which scampers excitedly because someone else wants something, so do superior people respect the superior animal which lives its own life and knows that the puerile stick throwing of alien bipeds are none of its business and beneath its notice. The dog barks and begs and tumbles to amuse you with the crack of the whip. That pleases a meekness-loving peasant who relishes a stimulus to his own self-importance. The cat, on the other hand, charms you in playing for its own benefit when it wishes to be amused, making you rush about the room with a paper on a string when it feels like exercise, but refusing all your attempts to make it play when it is not in their humor. That is personality and individuality and self-respect, the calm mastery of being whose life is its own and not yours. And the superior person recognizes and appreciates this because he too is a free soul whose position is assured and whose only law is his own heritage and aesthetic sense. Wow. So there you have it. Now, unfortunately, Lovecraft did have a cat. The reason to say this is because the name, it has the N and then man. It was a black cat. And you're thinking, oh no. So this. You always see people stress this. People remember this. Yeah. So he got this cat when he was 9 years old, 1899, and had him until 1904. So this is again, during the time he is growing up. We don't even know if he actually named the cat. Is that making sense? So when people say this, it's like, it's not like he had this cat later on in life. Is that making sense? Are you guys following? Okay. He wrote a few other, of course, stories. The Cephalus, right? The picture in the house. It's a good one. But now starts the Cthulhu mythos. I want to make sure I hit some highlights before we close up, though. And of course, another one was Nyarlathotep, which is a favorite of mine. I really enjoy that one. We could talk about those maybe afterwards if you want to. And then, of course, the Nameless City, 1921. The Outsider is, again, another one of my favorites. You know, this person is, you know, he's in this castle. He rises to the tower. You know, it's moonlight, and he escapes and this place, and he explores. He goes to another castle, and he arrives there, and everybody's screaming and in fear. And you know, he's like, "Oh, I'm scared." He sees this monster. I mean, this monster is pretty scary, right? I kind of even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and dissolution, the putrid dripping eidolon of unwholesomeness, revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty of the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. And it turns out he's looking in a mirror. It's himself, the darkness within. Unfortunately, we have to, I promise I'm going to address this. Let's talk about briefly the racism. Let's take care of that real quick. He has a dark legacy, as you can see. Lovecraft was a product of his time. He was a product of his mom. He was a product of his dad. He's a product of his context of that time. The real question we have to ask is, does he change? Right? That's the question we have to ask. His father, as you said, was, you know, as I said, was very proud. And in fact, he was also proud just of his Anglo-Nordic stock. So he was prejudicial at first as a child against fellow Caucasians. You know, only the British and the Norse were worthy. Then he goes, oh, maybe the Greeks and Latin Romans too. You know, he starts adding people as time goes on. he starts to change. But of course, he talks against, as I said, he talks against undesirable Latins. What are, he says, low-grade Southern Italians and Portuguese, right? And the plague of French Canadians, He talks, of course, about Jews, and so he talks about, so the anti-Semitism is there. That's going to change, by the way. You know that, right? He's going to change from that because remember, he marries, guess what? A Jewish wife. And one of his best friends is, guess what? Jewish, right? Things do change as time goes on. And he does oppose later on Hitler's treatment of the Jews. You guys know that. So he is a changing figure. So we have to be careful because we have Lovecraft in 1910, 19-teens, you have in the 20s, you have in the 30s, and he's different people according to that time. And the problem is we cherry pick and we say, this is the Lovecraft, and this is how we should remember him. We should always see him as somebody who changes as time goes on. Okay, so you have the shadow over Insamut. It seems that they said is an allegory against the mixing of races, but he doesn't allude to this. He doesn't talk about this. And in fact, in many cases, it turns out that when it comes to the monstrous other, in some cases, especially those within the context of Massachusetts, it turns out that some of the monsters that cause all the problems are the humans who attack first and have to then go for the ramifications. Does that make sense? So you're going to have that happen as well. Okay, so as time goes on, okay, so then he starts to change. He says, well, but he does say that, well, as long as other people are harmonizing their values with Western culture, then they're acceptable. So if you change your values in America and you become American, then that's acceptable. You're thinking, okay, so that's where he evolves to. No, then he changes again in the 1930s, where he says, no, I think that every ethnicity should attempt to preserve their microcultures. What? He goes the other direction. He said, no, we should preserve it. In fact, he goes on, not to believe this. He's a real friend of civilization, which is merely to make the Germans more German, the French more French, the Spaniards more Spaniard, et cetera, et cetera. What? So then he just about faces. So I got to tell you, he changes his mind, right? He goes from one to the other. So to say he believed this, yes, that year, the next year, he may be saying something else. He's a figure that's constantly evolving, but that does not excuse what he did, right? We should not go into an apologetic to defend Lovecraft, but we do have to understand that he is a product of that time. So what do Lovecraft scholars, what do they say about this? Well, they say quite a bit, right? Alan Moore and Philip Ale and a few others. But the point of the matter is, I like Alan Moore. Here it goes. He says, in this light, it is possible to perceive Howard Lovecraft as an almost unbearably sensitive barometer, of American dread. Barometer, can't even talk today. Barometer of American dread. Far from outlandish eccentricities, the fear that generates Lovecraft stories and opinions were previously those of the white middle-class heterosexual Protestant-descended males who are most threatened by the shift of power relationships and values of the modern world. Philip Ill says, I haven't made peace with this tension. By the way, Philip is Jewish, and I'm not sure if I ever will, but I have decided that perhaps he's the literary icon our country deserves. Interesting. The stories he conjured in many ways say as much about his bigotry as they do his genius. Or, and he refers to Moore, as Moore writes, coded in our alphabet of monsters, Lovecraft's writings offer a potential key to understanding our current dilemma. So we should learn from our history, not disregard it. Don't ignore it. Learn from why he believed what he believed, what made those changes. How come he didn't, change completely? Of course, his life was cut incredibly short. So, we don't know what would happen to him after World War II. We just don't know, right? Well, now I have to mention he meets Sonia Greene. So I'll go to 10. Is that fine? So yes. Okay. Sonia Greene. They met in July of 1921. I love this. Lovecraft actually writes a biography for her right when they meet, because that's what he does. So he says this. He said, Miss Greene is Russian and descended from illustrious line of artists and educators. Coming at an early age to the United States, she acquired a remarkable amount of erudition, mainly through her own initiative. Being now a master of several languages and deeply read in all the literatures and philosophies of modern Europe, probably no more thorough student of continental literature has ever held membership in amateurdom. It's great, right? Okay. She was at great pains to educate herself. She took extension courses at Columbia University. Kleiner was the one who introduced the two. He describes her as a very attractive woman of Juno-esque proportions. That means that, you know, she's very, very tall. Also, Galpin notes, oh, I love this one. Galpin notes about her, said that when, quote, she dropped in on my reserved and bookish student life at Madison, I felt like an English cobra. I felt like an English dove transfixed by a cobra. Juno-esque and commanding, with superb black eyes and hair. She was too regal to be a Dostoevsky character and seemed rather a heroine of some of the most martial pages of War and Peace. Proclaiming the glory of the free and enlightened human personality, she declared herself a person unique in depth and intensity of passion and urged me to write, to do, to create. This is the person who would eventually marry Lovecraft. Sonia was an NAPA member in the New York area. She also worked in the clothing industry, and she made $10,000 a year, which is quite a bit, you know, so money was coming in. She was a writer, in many ways. You know, Lovecraft was dating somebody else. What? Dating a certain Winifred Virginia Jackson, but we don't know much about that. We do know that he wrote a letter to her and included a snapshot of his mother along with praises of her beauty, which I'm not sure how that, you know, the person you're going out with would like that. It's like, wow, thanks, that's your mom. What are you doing? Yeah, he wasn't very good at this, right? In fact, what happened is, well, Sonia takes on the reins, kind of pushes forward. You know, she becomes obsessed with him pretty quickly, to the point where she within a short period of time. In fact, they met in July. By September, she actually went up to his home, stayed in a hotel, met the aunts, hung out, and was very aggressive. And as a result, he passively kind of went with it. In fact, it took about 3 years to convince him that they should get married, which they did on March 3rd of 1924. Let's talk about his intimacy. You guys want to learn about how it is to be a Lovecraft? Oh boy. Okay, so before he was a virgin when they married. He read tons of books to get ready for that big moment. So he did his research. And of course, he still had problems with this idea ever since he was 8 years old, but he, you know, I'll try it, right? They got married on the night of their first time together. They didn't do anything. He was busy working on a manuscript and had a deadline, so nothing happened at that point. Priorities, right? Deadlines. She remarked they're simply too exhausted for any honeymooning or anything else. Yet, when they were intimate, all that book reading paid off. As Sonia wrote, as a married man, he was an adequately excellent lover, but refused to show his feelings in the presence of others. He shunned promiscuous associations with women before his marriage. She also noted that HP was inarticulate in expressions of love, except to his mother and to his aunts, to whom he expressed himself quite vigorously. To all others, he was expressed by deep appreciation only. One way of expression of HP sentiments, she says, was that he would wrap his pinky finger around mine and say, oomph. Oh boy. He never said, I love you. He just said, I appreciated you. So he just couldn't say the word love. But they got together. They're married. He put on, he rounded up to be about 200 pounds as a result of her delicious home cooked meals. Because he said that he was so hungry looking. She fed him cheese souffle for breakfast and just kept fattening him up with all these. And you know what she did? Now remember, she's Jewish, right? So all of a sudden, he's finding himself within this milieu of not just the Jewish community, but others. Are you guys getting this now? But also, he discovered there's another community, because they're going to move to, guess where? New York, right? And New York, you're going to meet all kinds of people. Well, she introduced him to a new kind of food, because he liked New England fare, that's the best. Guess what? She converted him over to Italian. He loved Italian food. Are you seeing the change? Yeah. And then she looked at him going, you dress terrible, right? You look like you're from the 19th century. So what happened? Well, they went shopping. And so what happened as a result is that he had a new look. He had a flatbush overcoat, and he loved the overcoat. And all of a sudden I like this. So now he's dressing different. He's relaxing lots of his views. Are you getting this? He's a changing person, and Sonia is a part of that change. Sometimes it's the unknown that breeds prejudice. And as time goes on, he is learning that unknown, and it becomes suddenly known. It's not as scary anymore. And his viewpoints, again, are changing. During this time, of course, he writes the story called Cool Air, as connected to his New York context, right? Which I wish I could talk about, but I can't. And then, of course, he moves on to Rats in the Walls during the same period of time. Then The Shunned House, and then Imprisoned with Pharaohs. Oh, these are great books. And with Houdini wakes up down in an abyss. He writes The Hound. It looks like marriage is working out for him now, because all of a sudden, at first, because prolific writing, right? But as time goes on, Sonia, unfortunately, has to move to Cleveland because of a job opportunity. And so has to leave Lovecraft there in a first floor apartment. And he did not like living here. He liked the other place, but he didn't like living there. During this time, he was very involved in the Kalim Club, had 4 regular attendees. Of course, we all familiar with Frank Belknap Long, but also he became friends with Samuel Loveman, who was Jewish, and they became very close friends. Unfortunately, not soon, Greene lost her business, and due to her assets disappeared in a bank failure. And so now Lovecraft finds he has to work to help support them, right? Meanwhile, he had a job opportunity. He did. He was offered, get this, the publisher Weird Tales, which published many of his works, decided, they're losing money. And they offered him a job as an editor. Lovecraft was offered a job. You know what happened? He declined. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. This, menial kind of work. And unfortunately, then the editorship for this particular periodical goes to a person who hated Lovecraft. And Lovecraft had always wrote scathing reviews of his works. So now Lovecraft is trying to submit works, and he's rejecting them, and they're coming back. So how are you going to make money that way? This is a difficult time, right? Things are getting worse, right? By the way, this person's name is Farnsworth Wright. If you're wondering who. Sonia then became ill. And then she recovered. Then she moved to Cincinnati, then Cleveland. And so now she's just constantly moving. So she's not there. And you can see the marriage is starting to fall apart because she is not there. He did say later on, he actually gave a percentage. He said 98% of the reason why they got divorced later on was financial reasons. But then again, they did seem to be very different in personality. So there you have that. Okay, so Lovecraft then had to move to another working class area. By the way, the worst part happens is that there's a theft where he's living, and they took everything he had. Everything, including all the clothing that he loved, including that jacket. It's all gone. All he had left were the clothes upon his body. So he is hitting rock bottom. So what is he going to do? He's going to write. That's right. What does he write? Well, he starts to put together all these different kinds of works. He moves to working class area, Brooklyn Heights. He resided in a tiny apartment, and then he moves in 1926, and he leaves for Providence, Rhode Island. I'm going home. And he lived with his aunts, who, by the way, didn't like at all Sonia. They even disapproved of the marriage. Just telling you that a little ahead of time. So he wrote The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. He wrote The Dream Quest of Unknown Cadith. He wrote The Color of Space during this period of time, 1928. And then all of a sudden, we're starting to move to, of course, The Call of Cthulhu. And this came about, there's a reference to this as early as 1920. Even though he wrote 1928, he writes of a dream sequence, and many of those aspects are there. The theme of a fashioning of a bas-relief by a modern sculptor is retained in The Call of Cthulhu from this early writing from 1920, as well as the dream influenced the sculptor. Also, Wilcox actually says the words about Babylonia that's mentioned in this dream. So you have this background. What influenced The Call of Cthulhu? Many different threads. One, by the way, was theosophy. Most people don't know that. Helen Blavatsky, he had been reading this, which of course is mysticism with Gnosticism, science with paganism, right? This is all coming together. And he even refers to the theosophy within this particular work. Blavatsky also, he was influenced by references to Atlantis and Lemuria. But what was his own personal reason for writing The Call of Cthulhu? Yeah. Well, guess what? He tells us. Isn't that great? I love it. I love hearing about Lovecraft, talking about Lovecraft, as opposed to we're sitting around going, I wonder why. Why don't we just listen to Lovecraft and see what he says? So, of course, he submitted the story, and guess what happens? It gets rejected. Can you believe it? The Call of Cthulhu is rejected. So he does a rewrite, and he sends it again. This time with a rebuttal about why this work is important. Because apparently they didn't think it was that important. So he felt like he had to say something. So he says, now this. He says, now all my tales are based upon the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. To me, there's nothing but plurality in a tale in which the human form and the local human passions and conditions and standards are depicted as native to other worlds or other universes. To achieve the essence of real externality, whether of time or space or dimension, one must forget that such things as organic life, of good and evil, of love and hate, and all such local attitudes of a negligible and temporary race called mankind have any existence at all. Cthulhu is the ultimate, the other. And he was tired of these writers talking about extraterrestrials, looking like us, acting like us, following our customs. He says, no, they have to be completely and totally alien, totally foreign. And he's putting together, he's creating not a mythology, he's creating an anti-mythology. An anti-mythology, okay? So, because mythology is about what? Justifying the ways of God to men. Well, he doesn't want to do that, right? He wants to, there's no justification. There's no sense. They have their own motives. They have their own ideas. That's beyond us to understand. And we will perhaps never understand it. We don't even have the cognitive ability to decipher who they are. The name Cthulhu, it's intended to baffle us. He writes that the word is supposed to represent a fumbling human attempt to catch the phonetics of an absolutely non-human word. The name of the hellish entity was invented by beings whose vocal organs were not like man's. Hence, it has no relation to the human speech equipment. It is completely foreign and alien. So just by saying Cthulhu, we probably have it wrong. It's something that is beyond us, beyond our comprehension. And of course, he starts writing, of course, other works, the Dunwich Horror. By the way, this is great stuff, right? Oh, I love this. I know. Oh boy, these are great works. But he does this a lot. And of course, he does something important, and that is he always talks about smell, the scent of things, the scent of decay. And what happens is this, is that we as humans, even animals, when we smell decay, we become alert. There's been studies on this. We become vigilant. Maybe there's a wariness of danger. It's an instinctive. We smell something that's bad, right? We're repulsed by it. He makes sure that he writes about the sense, and he does this quite a bit so that we can smell it as well as see it and feel it and hear it. He wants to use all the senses. In fact, of course, I like this, in the color of space, he said that, when it comes to the color, it's not really a color. It's beyond our comprehension. It's beyond our ability to see it from our visual range. So it's something that we don't understand fully when we look at it. So, and if you're interested, there's a great article that is put together. It's called The Dreadful Reality, Fear, Madness, and the Fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. So just want to mention that. Okay, moving right along. Then The Shadow over Insamut was published in 1931, right? What another great story that I wish I could tell you about, but I can't. Yep. And so, oh boy, I actually have the whole story written out. So I took excerpts from the story and put it all together here. Oh, Lovecraft then, of course, moves to Prospect Street in 1933. And of course, Lovecraft and meanwhile his wife, they pull away. Greene actually moves to California, becomes Davis, and remarried in 1936. She did divorce him. It was amicable. Well, she tried to. It turned out that Lovecraft never signed the papers. So they're probably still together. And then this is the final segment right here. We got to conclude his life, right? But we got to go here. And that is finally, he changed again. What? He changed again. The Great Depression changed Lovecraft's political views. You see, as a child, he saw himself as a faithful Tory, supported the idea of a monarchy rather than a president when he's 8 years old, right? Lovecraft considered democracy as a problematic option. He said that the theory of democracy basically is very different than the actual application of this system in the real world. He said today, all government involves the most obtuse and complicated technology, so that the average citizen is absolutely without power to form any intelligent estimate of the value of a proposed measure. Only the most highly trained technicians can have any idea of what any government policy or operation is about. Hence, the so-called will of the people is merely superstitious, without the least trace of value in meeting and dealing with specific problems. In fact, he says, no non-technician, be he an artist, philosopher, or scientist, can even begin to judge the labyrinthine governmental problems with which these administrators must deal. So he says, you have to be so trained to understand the complexity of our democracy. In fact, he said democracy, as distinguished from universal opportunity and good treatment, is today a fallacy and impossibility so great that any serious attempts to apply it cannot be considered as other than a mockery and a jest. Government by popular vote means merely the nomination of doubtfully qualified men by doubtfully authorized and seldom competent cliques of professional politicians representing hidden interests, followed by a sardonic farce of emotional persuasion in which the orators, with their glibest tongues and flashiest catchwords, herd on their side a numerical majority of blindly impressionable dolts and gulls who have, for the most part, no idea of what the whole circus is about, unquote. Wow. Okay. He's writing this in the 20s. Yeah. So Lovecraft advocated that only the most intelligent should vote and that they should pass rigorous educational examinations. Don't worry, he's going to change his mind. This is the 20s. That's why I have to tell you, I have to set this up because you got to see his change. And I'm going to let him demonstrate that to you as opposed to me. Is that good? He's argued for a sort of meritocracy within government ruled by the elite. He says more nonsense has been uttered in this country over the perils of elitism than almost any other subject. All government known to history has been government by the minorities, and it is in the interest of everyone, most especially the poor and powerless, to have a governing minority composed of able, intelligent, responsive, and decent persons with a large view for the general welfare. There is a vast difference between an elite of conscience and an elite of privilege. The difference that Thomas Jefferson drew between the natural aristocracy founded on virtues and talents and the artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth, adding that the natural aristocracy is the most precious gift of nature for the government of the society. Now you're thinking, this it's okay, it's interesting stuff. He does something, here it goes, because I have to address all these issues and its complexity. He calls this viewpoint fascism. You go, what? So you're going to see Lovecraft, oh, he was a fascist. Well, no, because this is not quite. This phrase was just coming out. This is the 20s. We don't know. We have Mussolini at that time, but we don't know about the rise of Hitler. We don't know about the fascists rising up, even in the United States. We don't know that. So he's using this term because he thinks it applies to it, and it's going to bite him in the end. Because when he realizes, is this become something else? Because for him, fascism was natural aristocracy, which is Jeffersonian. See, are you seeing? You got to take him in context. Are you guys learning a lot here? He doesn't know that, you know. And when it morphed into something else, what did he do? He disassociated from the term. He didn't use it. It's like, oh, because words, believe it or not, change over even in a short period of time. And of course, Hitler connected to that. Yet his entire family was Republican. He voted for Herbert Hoover in 1928, right? Yeah. But the Great Depression changed things. And yes, he did look at Adolf Hitler. But what I find is fascinating is that he actually writes about the government of Adolf Hitler in what's called European Glimpses, which was actually supposed to be an autobiography written by his wife, Sonia, even though it was ex-wife at that time. Isn't that interesting? And so he's writing about that, her perspectives of Adolf Hitler. So it's not necessarily an endorsement. In fact, let's take care of that right now, because you're going to see, oh, he supported Hitler. No. Let's catch the. I'm kind of taking care of some lasting questions. So here we go. Okay, so he gross wrote it for his ex-wife. He says, during my 5 days, which is his wife's 5 days, in Wiesbaden, I had the opportunity to observe the disturbed political state of Germany and the constant squabbles between various dismally uniform factions of would-be patriots. Of all the self-appointed leaders, Hitler alone seems to retain a cohesive and enthusiastic following. His sheer magnetism and force of will serving, in spite of deficiencies in true social insight, to charm, drug, or hypnotize the hordes of youthful Nazis who blindly revere and obey him. Doesn't sound like a very good press for Hitler there. What do you think? Without possessing any clear-cut or well-founded program for Germany's economic reconstruction, he plays theatrically on the younger generation's military emotions and a sense of national pride, urging them to overthrow the restrictive provisions of the Versailles Treaty and reassert the strength and the supremacy of the German people. Hitler's lack of clear, concrete objectives seemed to lose him nothing with the crowd. I don't think that's an endorsement. What do you think? Is this helpful? Is this good, right? So what does it happen? He decides that I am sick of the Republican Party. What? Here we go. Oh, you're going to love this because I'm going to quote him on this, not me. Here he goes. So he switches. In 32, he switches over to, guess who? Franklin Roosevelt. He becomes a Democrat. He switches and he supports cautiously the New Deal, although he felt that the reforms did not go far enough. He says, that is why we must go slowly and cautiously, lending our support to anything headed in the right direction, which has real chance of adoption, even if it does not suit us exactly as some other plan, which has less chance of adoption. The New Deal, in spite of its present internal inconsistencies and frankly experimental phases, probably represents as great a step in the right direction as could now command any chance of support. He says, you know, you can only go so far, but you have to go through slowly because you got to follow where the people are at. And then he goes a little bit further. He switches over. He says, you know what? I don't think the elite should rule anymore. What? Oh, I thought we just established that he thought that this was, yeah, guess what? He changes his mind. You want me to read that? Yes, I will. So what happens is the more I observe the abysmal, implicit ignorance of the bulk of the allegedly cultivated people, folks who think a lot of themselves and their positions, and who also include a vast quota of university graduates. Ooh, ouch. The more I believe that something is radically wrong with conventional education and tradition. These pompous, self-complacent best people with their blind spots, delusions, prejudices, and callousness, poor devils who have no conception of their orientation to human history and the cosmos, are victims of some ingrained fallacy regarded in the development and the direction of cerebral energy. They don't lack brains, but have never been taught how to get the full benefit of what they have. As for Republicans, how can one regard seriously, he says, a frightened, greedy, nostalgic huddle of tradesmen and lucky idlers who shut their eyes to history and science, steel their emotions against decent human sympathy? Wait, Lovecraft is talking about sympathy? Are you guys following me? Wait, he wouldn't do that a decade earlier. Are you guys following me? Cling to their sordid and provincial ideas, exalting sheer acquisitions and condoning artificial hardship for the non-materiality shrewd, dwell smugly and sentimentally in a distorted dream cosmos of outmoded phrases and principles and attitudes based on bygone agricultural handcraft worlds, and revel in, consciously or unconsciously, in mendocious assumptions such as the notion that real liberty is synonymous with the single detail of unrestricted economic license, or that irrational planning of resource distribution would contravene some vague and mystical American heritage, utterly contrary to the fact and without the slightest foundation in human experience. Intellectually, the Republican idea deserves the tolerance and respect one gives to the dead. Unquote. Wow. He changes. Let's keep going. He's going to die now. Of course, I'm sorry. In 1936, they published The Shadow of Insamut in the paperback book. 400 copies were printed. It was filled with errors. It didn't do very well. They even burned the last 200. And this kind of broke his heart. He didn't have a good reception of At the Mountain of Madness. They didn't like it. I like that, but they didn't like it. He declined psychologically, physically. He started going downhill. He had a close friend named Robert E. Howard, and they became good friends. But then Howard's mom, who was critically ill, did not wake up from a coma. And so one of his closest friends basically took a pistol and committed suicide. This impacted Lovecraft even further. Now, he's going, becomes bleak. He thinks that he's going to be forgotten. I have no illusions concerning the precarious status of my tales, and do not expect to become a serious competitor of my favorite weird authors. And then he starts to decline, and he dies on March 15th, 1937, complications of terminal cancer of the small intestine. And his last words were, sometimes the pain is unbearable. Well, let's leave you on this thought. Right. He says, let's end with two quotes from him. There are not many persons, he says, who know what wonders are open to them in the stories and visions of their youth. For when as children we learn and dream, we think but half-formed thoughts. And when as men we try to remember, we are dulled and prosaic with the poison of life. But some of us awake in the night with strange phantasms of enchanted hills and gardens, of fountains that sing in the sun, of golden cliffs overhanging murmuring seas, of plains that stretch down to sleeping cities of bronze and stone, and of shadowy companies of heroes that ride compassed with white horses along the edges of thick forests. And then we know that we have looked back through the ivory gates into that world of wonder which was ours before we were wise and unhappy. And finally, to be bitter is to attribute intent and personality to the formless, infinite, unchanging, and unchangeable world. We drift on a chartless, restless sea. Let us sing when we can and forget the rest. Thank you. All right. Okay. Well, there you go. Let's see if I can do this picture thing. There you go. All right. There you go. Let's see. I'm going to get to you guys here. I guess we just get it there, like this way. There we go. Maybe I'll turn the flash on. What do you think? There we go. Okay, maybe it'll work. Let's see, 1, 2, and no, I guess maybe it works anyway. And we'll do this here. All right, there we go. Okay. Okay. Well, would you guys, any questions?
I have a few questions in the chat.
Okay. Who?
So, a gentleman who had to be he said that in his opinion, Alan Moore, pardon me,
One more?
Alan Moore isn't properly a Lovecraft scholar.
No, he's not. But he does.
He enough Lovecraft to make comics based on, and that's about it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, he's not a Lovecraft scholar, but he does participate in the reception of Lovecraft within popular culture.
And then also, he mentions that there's no proof that Lovecraft dated Jackson.
Well, they're right. The authority for that is Josie, who is the most preeminent Lovecraft scholar alive.
Okay.
So.
And then he brought up another reason why he didn't want to move, or why he didn't take the job. Because he would have to move to Chicago.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't want to move to Chicago.
Right.
And we want to stay where he's at. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, two reasons. Number one, Chicago was out in the Midwest, and Lovecraft did not want to leave his beloved New England.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the problem with the problem with Lovecraft is that he is resistant to change no matter what.
Exactly.
So he fights tooth and nail. I mean, you could barely get him to New York. And he's like, oh, I kind of like New York, until, of course, they steal his clothes and everything else. Then it goes dark pretty fast. But the point of the matter is, he's resistant. What should have happened, or maybe could have happened, is the idea that maybe Sonia or somebody should have encouraged him, because that would have given him quite a bit of power and prestige, and get out of his comfort zone, because she was good at that. Got him eating Italian food, got him eating. I mean, he gained, quite a bit of weight.
Yeah.
As a result. Was it 40 pounds? And
the
Jewish cuisine and everything else. I mean, so
introduced to a much wider circle of friends than he would have known
not ordinarily.
living in Providence.
But the problem with his personality is he needed to be coaxed, needed to be encouraged, and the other part is that he's basically, his mom dies, and he switches to another mom.
Yeah.
That's Sonia. So basically, the mother figure. He needed to have a mother figure that dotes upon him, that encourages him, and and of course. But the funny thing is, even though mom was kind of misguided at first, in many ways, hey, you're a girl with golden locks. The point of the matter is that eventually, mom is like his biggest supporter, the rooter, but doesn't want him, of course, obviously join the war effort. But the point is that they're very, very, very close, incredibly close. And then when she dies, Sonia just happens to come within that very short period of time. So there she is. And so there's somebody else to motivate him. But the problem is that Sonia goes away. She moves away, starts traveling around, trying to, and as a result, he starts becoming more and more set in his ways. And then, of course, something scares him. And that theft did scare him. He was also nervous living on also at one point when he's on the ground floor. He was very nervous about living there. And he just kept going from one place to the next that were bad in New York. And then eventually a little better towards the end, but then Brooklyn Heights, I guess. Well, and then after that, it's like, I'm back home. So he went back to his nest. But the thing is that it would have been good for his career. It would have been good for his publications to have a direct hand in this periodical. But again, I think we understand now through this talk his personality, do we not? Right? I mean, we do. We have a fair idea based upon his own words. Very, I mean, he does. I mean, he goes from one thing to the other when it comes to interests, and then, but as opposed to disregarding them, except for the Arabian Nights a little bit, he brings it all together. He adds it to it, so everything connects to each other. So he goes, hey, I like astronomy. Hey, that goes into my science fiction, right? I love the sciences. I love adventure. I love detective stories, and all these features. I mean, really, a lot of his stories are detective like. You could start off, you're going, oh yeah, this is like you're trying to guess what happens. It's a mystery, and yeah. So that answered that question, I think. Any others?
Yeah. Would you say that one of the themes in Lovecraft stories is xenophobia?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that's a story of his life.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he is, and again, he's being he's sheltered, he's cloistered by his mom, and there is, unfortunately, there is also this mental illness that makes him even more prone to be paranoid. And when he's paranoid, and when he's in an uncomfortable space, what he does is he strikes out. I have to tell you, I don't want to be on the wrong end of one of Lovecraft's letters. You have so many of these horrendous adjectives that he just throws at you that make you feel like you're just this big. You don't want to be on that end because all of a sudden it seems like he has this raging anger that flows out of him. And yet, according to Greene, according to his wife, he was always reserved in person. He held himself off a little bit when it comes to special things. He's more powerful via the letter. He's one of those people, you meet, he destroys you, and you meet him, and he's just like very calm. He has this kind of very calm facade. He kind of looks like the guy from Facebook a little bit, right? Right, doesn't he?
He's like the person on the internet who seems to be kind of a milquetoast, and then when he gets on the internet, it's firing nukes.
Yeah, and then when we meet in person, he's just like, his little suit and little cuffs, and it's like, this guy did that. Watch out! You just don't get him behind the pen, because when he's in private doing his own thing, he's pretty scathing. Yes.
Perhaps because he didn't really get to interact with people till he got into his middle teens. When he was in high school, he said he got friends. He didn't know how to be physically confrontational, but he could do it through his writing.
Yes.
Because he didn't have to encounter that person in that space. He could do it from a distance and be strong in his thoughts and have power over what he has to say, because you didn't have that person right there confronting him and interrupting him.
Yeah, he wasn't properly socialized.
Yeah.
You know, they isolated him, and he was in his little ivory tower, so to speak, and he did his own thing, and he was allowed to be very selfish. Meanwhile, they're supporting, you know, his whatever he says. They go, oh, that's great, great, you know. And then of course, you know, he did that great speech for, you know, for his middle school, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, that great speech, which by the way just kind of shows he's not really in touch, even with kids. You know, he loved doing everything when it comes to play sets. Everything had to be in its own special place. And so he'd do these elaborate plays with all these characters and all the scenery. He got, for a short period of time, he even got into drama. Was into that. But all the game pieces, in a sense, all the scenes had to be done his way. It has to be my way or the highway. So the kids, they have to play along with him. He's the one that made the stratagems when it came to the detective society. You heard him himself say that, right? He's the one who made the scenarios. He's even the one putting the blood on the floor. He's doing everything, and they are just set pieces going along with whatever is happening. So there's also a sense of fear, xenophobia, but this also intrinsic need for control. He's got to control, and he doesn't like things out of control, which is interesting because his writings are all about chaos. It's all about the other,
What frightens him.
and that's what frightens him. And so, in a sense, it's almost like a catharsis. He's writing what he knows, and he's throwing all his fears and anxieties into his writings, and they're going there.
Well, it's, for example, Lovecraft, though he loved ocean voyages, was terrified of what was under the ocean.
Yes. Yeah.
Lovecraft was terrified to death of fish and especially cephalopods, octopi, and squid. Just terrified the daylights out of it.
Yep. Ouch.
It's also why, for example, he was nauseated by the very sight of seafood, as he put it.
Yeah.
That's why I used to have a button that said H.P. Lovecraft is alive and well and tends a sushi bar in Pasadena.
Yeah. Yep. No, he didn't like mollusks. Yeah, he mentions mollusks quite a bit in his writings. So, ouch. Gotta pull a muscle here. Aye. So, any other questions?
Not really, but I really like how you went into detail on the important parts of life, and it's really funny too how you mentioned that they stole, well, they had a theft, and because in one of his letters, I'm not really sure who he wrote to, but he did mention that they stole his favorite coat.
Yep.
And he was really mad about his pet.
Yeah,
And,
the very first coat
Yeah.
that they got together.
And another thing was that I like how you mentioned that he got another mother as soon as his mother passed away
Yep.
because she was 7 years older than him.
Yep.
And as well as another thing,
Yep.
you mentioned that when he said I was a little girl when he was a child,
Yeah.
His mom would actually dress him up in dresses
Yeah.
that were
Right.
normal at the time.
Yeah.
During that time, and as well as
But he fought against it. You know, suddenly he's like, no, I'm not doing this.
and another thing that was kind of weird that I remember reading was that when he was a little older, his mom would dress him in his father's clothes,
Mhm.
and it was some sort of weird thought was a thing, but it could also be that they were just poor, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that what I would do in this talk is I would focus in on his childhood, because I think oftentimes we look at Lovecraft and we focus in on him in the middle of life, or we go the other way. And I think if you learn about his childhood, he makes a lot more sense. You know, you see, you know, all these ideas really are Lovecraftian ideas are all the way back during the time of his childhood. You know, he's 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age. He's already developing much of who he's going to be, but just magnified on an adult level. So, yeah. Good. Oh, I actually I want to get you in the picture. I didn't get everybody. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Let's see. There we go. On to it. Okay. All right. How are we doing, Terry?